You wake up and you can't feel your feet. It's 20,000 years ago, and the world outside your shelter is a wall of white. The wind is a living thing, screaming across a frozen landscape that stretches farther than anyone has ever walked. There are no crops. There are no stores. There is no heating except the fire you have to keep alive with your own hands, and if that fire goes out on the wrong night, you and everyone you love will simply freeze to death in the dark. This was daily life for our ancestors during the last ice age, and here is the thing that should genuinely amaze you. They didn't just survive it, they thrived in it. They spread across some of the most brutal environments the planet has ever thrown at a species, and they came out the other side as the dominant animal on Earth. So how did soft, hairless, tropical apes survive tens of thousands of years of crushing cold? The answer is a masterclass in human ingenuity, and it explains a lot about why you exist. First, let's understand what we're actually talking about, because the Ice Age is bigger and stranger than most people realize. For most of the last 100,000 years, the Earth was locked in a glacial period. Massive ice sheets, in some places kilometers thick, covered huge portions of the northern hemisphere. Sea levels were far lower because so much water was frozen into ice. Vast regions that are now forest or farmland were frozen grassland, tundra, and glacier. And roaming across this frozen world were creatures out of a nightmare or a legend. Woolly mammoths, woolly rhinos, giant cave bears, saber-toothed cats, enormous herds of reindeer and bison. This was the world our ancestors were born into, and they had a serious problem. Humans are, fundamentally, a tropical species. We evolved in the warmth of Africa. We have thin skin, very little body hair, and almost no natural insulation. Physically, we are astonishingly badly equipped for cold. A naked human being drops into dangerous hypothermia in conditions that a mammoth or a reindeer wouldn't even notice. By all rights, we should never have been able to live in the frozen north at all, and yet we did. The reason comes down to one thing above all others. We didn't adapt our bodies to the cold. We used our minds to build the adaptations instead. Let's start with the single most important technology in human history: fire. Fire was the beating heart of Ice Age survival, and it did far more than just keep people warm. It was light in the endless winter darkness. It was protection, because most predators are wary of flames. It was a tool for cooking, which made food safer and unlocked far more nutrition from every meal. And crucially, fire was the center of social life, the place where people gathered, planned, told stories, and passed down the knowledge that kept everyone alive. But here's what people underestimate. Keeping a fire going in a frozen, windswept, often wet environment is genuinely hard. It requires fuel, which is scarce when the whole world is frozen. It requires skill, shelter, and constant attention. The ability to not just make fire, but to maintain it, night after night, through storms and shortages, was a matter of life and death. A group that lost its fire in the deep cold was a group in mortal danger. So fire wasn't just a comfort, it was infrastructure, and protecting it was probably one of the most important jobs in any community. Next, clothing. And this is where humans did something no other animal has ever done. When we couldn't grow our own fur, we took it from animals that had it. The invention of tailored, fitted clothing was an absolute game changer, and it's more sophisticated than it sounds. We're not talking about just draping a hide over your shoulders. We're talking about cutting, shaping, and sewing animal skins into fitted garments that trapped body heat, layered against the wind, and could be taken off or added depending on conditions. This required tools. Archaeologists have found something that tells this story beautifully: the eyed needle, a small, humble piece of bone or ivory with a hole carefully drilled through one end, some of them tens of thousands of years old. That tiny invention meant humans could sew tight, warm, weatherproof clothing, and it may have been just as important to surviving the Ice Age as fire itself. Think about that. One of the technologies that let our species conquer the frozen world was essentially a sewing kit. Then there's shelter. In warmer climates, early humans could get by with simple, temporary camps. In the Ice Age, shelter became a serious engineering problem. In some regions, people took advantage of natural caves, which offered protection from the wind and a stable place to keep a fire. But in the open tundra, where there were no caves, humans built. and what they built is astonishing. In parts of Ice Age Europe, archaeologists have discovered the remains of huts constructed out of mammoth bones. Enormous structures, using the massive bones and tusks of mammoths as a framework, likely covered with hides to create a warm, sturdy dwelling. Building a house out of the bones of the largest land animals around you is not the work of primitive brutes. It's the work of engineers, planners, and cooperative communities working together toward a common goal. Now let's talk about food, because in a frozen world, eating is a constant challenge. Plants, the staple of warm climate diets, largely vanish under snow and ice for much of the year. So Ice Age humans became, above all, hunters. They became experts at tracking, ambushing, and killing some of the largest and most dangerous animals that have ever lived. A single mammoth could feed a group for a long time, providing not just meat but fat, hide for clothing and shelter, bones for tools and building, and sinew for thread. But hunting a mammoth or a woolly rhino or a herd of bison was extraordinarily dangerous, and it could not be done alone. And this points to the real secret weapon of Ice Age humanity: cooperation. You cannot bring down a mammoth by yourself. You cannot maintain a fire, build a bone hut, sew clothing for a whole family, track migrating herds across vast distances, and raise children through brutal winters, all as a lone individual. Ice Age survival was, fundamentally, a team sport. It required tight, trusting, highly coordinated groups of people who shared food, shared knowledge, shared labor, and looked out for one another. The humans who survived the Ice Age were the ones who could cooperate best. The loners died. The communities endured. This is a huge part of why we are such a deeply social species. The cold quite literally selected for teamwork. But cooperation alone wasn't enough. To bring down animals the size of a small truck, our ancestors also had to outthink them. And this is where Ice Age technology becomes genuinely impressive. They didn't just charge at a mammoth with a pointed stick and hope for the best. They engineered better weapons. One of the most important inventions was the spear thrower, a simple hooked stick that acts as a lever, effectively adding a second joint to your arm. With it, a hunter could launch a spear with far more speed, force, and range than by hand, striking a dangerous animal from a safer distance. Later came the bow and arrow, an even more sophisticated leap in hunting technology. They crafted spearheads and blades of stone, napped to a razor edge, and bound them to shafts with sinew and natural glue. But the tools were only part of it. The real weapon was strategy. Ice Age hunters used the landscape itself. They drove entire herds toward cliffs, stampeding them over the edge to their deaths, harvesting enormous quantities of meat in a single coordinated event. They funneled animals into natural traps, bogs, and narrow ravines where they could be surrounded. They read tracks, studied the migration patterns of the herds, and planned their hunts around the movements of animals across the frozen landscape. This was hunting as a form of applied intelligence, a fusion of tools, teamwork, and deep knowledge of the prey. A lone human is no match for a mammoth, but a coordinated group of humans armed with clever weapons and an even cleverer plan was the most dangerous predator the Ice Age had ever seen. There was also a nutritional secret to surviving the cold, and it's one we often forget in a modern world obsessed with avoiding it: fat. In a frozen environment, fat was not the enemy. It was the ultimate prize. Fat is the most calorie-dense food there is, and in a world of relentless cold and constant physical exertion, calories were everything. Ice Age humans prized the fattiest parts of their kills, because fat was what kept you warm, kept you fueled, and kept you alive through the lean times when food was scarce. Some researchers believe that access to fat and rich, calorie-dense animal foods was essential to fueling not just survival, but the large, energy-hungry human brain itself. In the Ice Age, a good meal wasn't lean. It was gloriously, life-savingly fatty. And then there's the sheer, stubborn adaptability of the human animal, which allowed our ancestors to do something no other primate had ever done: spread. During the Ice Age, humans migrated into environments that should have been utterly impossible for a tropical ape. They pushed north into the frozen edges of Europe and Asia. They crossed into territories no human had ever seen. At some point, groups crossed a land bridge, exposed by the low sea levels, from Asia into the Americas, walking into an entire continent for the first time. Others reached Australia by sea. Everywhere they went, they carried the same toolkit: fire, clothing, shelter, cooperation, and an endlessly flexible mind that could adapt to whatever the environment threw at it. We didn't survive the Ice Age by being physically tough. We survived it by being adaptable, by carrying our survival tools with us, and by rebuilding a warm little pocket of livable world wherever we went. But it wasn't only about tools and cooperation. There was something else, something harder to measure, but just as important: culture, knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of generations. An individual human, dropped alone into an Ice Age landscape, would almost certainly die. What kept people alive was everything they had been taught: how to read the weather, where the herds would migrate and when, which plants buried under snow were safe to dig up and eat, how to start a fire in the wet, how to treat a wound, how to build a shelter that wouldn't collapse. This knowledge was priceless, and it was passed down through stories, through teaching, through elders who carried decades of hard-won experience. In a world without books, the memory of an old person was the single most valuable library a community could have. The Ice Age didn't just reward strong bodies, it rewarded deep knowledge and the ability to pass it on. And here's something most people don't realize. For much of the Ice Age, our ancestors were not the only humans out there facing the cold. In the frozen north of Europe and Asia lived another kind of human entirely: the Neanderthals. And in many ways, they were better built for the cold than we were. Neanderthals had stockier, more compact bodies that conserved heat, wider noses that may have helped warm the frigid air they breathed, and immense physical strength. They had survived in these harsh northern lands for hundreds of thousands of years before our species ever arrived. They controlled fire, made tools, wore hides, hunted big game, and cared for their injured. By any reasonable measure, they were masters of the Ice Age world. And yet, in the end, it was our kind that endured, and the Neanderthals who vanished. Why? The truth is, we don't fully know, and it was probably a combination of factors. But one leading idea is that our advantage wasn't physical at all. It was social and cultural. Our ancestors seem to have lived in larger, more connected networks, trading goods, ideas, and knowledge across vast distances. They created more complex art, more elaborate tools, and more sophisticated ways of storing and sharing information. When times got hard, a wider web of connections may have meant more options, more knowledge to draw on, and more help to call upon. The Neanderthals were tougher, but we may have been better at cooperating, communicating, and adapting on the fly. In a world that was constantly changing, that flexibility may have been the deciding factor. The Neanderthals didn't lose because they were stupid or weak. They lost perhaps because the game had quietly changed from one of raw strength to one of connection and adaptability, and that was the game our ancestors were built to win. Eventually, of course, the ice began to retreat. Around 12,000 years ago, the climate warmed, the glaciers shrank, and the world our ancestors had known for tens of thousands of years transformed. The frozen tundra gave way to forests and grasslands. Many of the great Ice Age animals, the mammoths and the woolly rhinos, went extinct, possibly due to a combination of the changing climate and human hunting. And into this warming world stepped a species that had been forged and tested by some of the harshest conditions imaginable. Humans who had learned over countless generations to plan, to cooperate, to build, to adapt, and to survive almost anything. It was in this thawing world that humans would soon invent agriculture, build the first villages, and begin the long march toward civilization. But they carried the Ice Age with them, in their tools, in their social bonds, in their deep instinct for cooperation and survival. So how did ancient humans survive the Ice Age? Not with claws, or fur, or brute strength. They survived with fire and thread, with bone huts and sharpened spears, with tight-knit communities and the accumulated wisdom of generations. They survived because they could think, plan, cooperate, and adapt faster than the world could kill them. They took a body built for the tropics, and through sheer ingenuity, made it survive on the edge of the ice. Every person alive today is descended from those survivors, from people who stared down the deep cold and the mammoth and the endless winter dark and refused to die. So the next time you're cold and you reach for a warm coat, or turn up the heat, or huddle a little closer to a fire, take a second to feel the weight of it. Because you are doing exactly what your ancestors did 20,000 years ago on the frozen edge of the world. You are staying warm. You are staying alive. And you come from a very, very long line of people who were extraordinarily good at both.